Padre Nuestro is arguably one of the most important sites in the country, archaeologically as well as paleontologically, and looking at environmental data in the past as well. So we know that the cave formed and for a while was a dry cave because of the presence of those stalactites and stalagmites, which can only form in dry caves. And they've also found a lot of paleontological data about extinct species, so small non-human primate, as well as a couple of different species of sloth that went extinct actually around the same time that humans began to move into this area. And then as you kind of move further towards the mouth of the cave, you start seeing more like human associated activity. So we've found some rocks that would not have occurred naturally in that cave. A lot of them have evidence of chipping or of use. And then again, as you move up the ledge kind of towards the mouth of the cavern, you start seeing Taino ceramic sherds, very small pieces of bodies. Most likely they would have been from potizas or water bottles, or maybe pots that were being used to carry water, or maybe cooking vessels that were being washed. We believe that most of the remains in this cavern are from like utilitarian objects.
You read Las Casas, you read Ramon Panay, the early maybe a half dozen primary sources to get the background from the Spanish perspective. But what about the perspective of the Taino themselves? You know, they've got a story to tell. It's not just from the slanted view of those who are colonizing the America, but what about the archaeology of the Taino? So the water sites themselves, we look for ceramics. That's an indicator for water gathering. I'm certain that these sites that are the caverns are not necessarily religious offering sites, and yet we do see objects that may be ceremonial. There are literally hundreds of karst topography sinkholes here in the southeastern portion, percolating with water that goes through to make these aquifers, make for these large systems. Some of them open up in sinkholes for use by the Taino. Some of them even today are drilling holes and use them for water supply. So the waters here in the area for the hotels and the resorts are all also functioning from those same aquifer systems. We recognize these freshwater caverns with 300-foot visibility as important sites, not only just for water, but also for recreation. Many of these sites have been turned into recreational sites. Now, obviously, that's impacted the cultural material in these sites. I know back in the 70s and 80s, there's lots of publications of people diving in these caverns and picking up intact vessels. They've all been, for lack of a better word, hobby hunted or even looted of their archaeological integrity. So now we're down today for many of these sites looking at very small pieces. Some of the stones we see that are being carried in there, the lithic tools that we find from earlier culture times, the ceramic pieces, they tell us that it was used as a water supply, but it doesn't tell us what this might have looked like 20 years ago. So the archaeological integrity of these sites has been impacted as diving's come into the area, as free diving, as hundreds of people visit a tourist site. You can't expect that site to tell you the same information that might be a remote area that's not touched yet. As archaeologists, we have to look at both. They're both important to us, and they all tell the same story. Is what about these Taino? Who were these people? What were they doing? Where were they living? And how did they interact with their environment, which includes the entire area here of the national parks here in the east.
I'm Kirsten Hawley. I'm a PhD student at Indiana University in archaeology and earth science. So I'm here in the Dominican Republic doing some field research for some preliminary data for my dissertation in the future, and working with Charlie Beaker on the Living Museums in the Sea archaeology. Taino is a cultural designation that we use for the late prehistoric peoples of the Greater Antilles, so Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Cuba especially, and a lot of people think that they went extinct, which isn't true. with the advent of DNA testing, we know that a lot of people in these islands still have a significant amount of Taino DNA, and a lot of their cultural kind of folklore and other ideas have been passed down as well and are kind of ingrained in Dominican culture, Puerto Rican culture, things like that. However, we don't really know what Taino means, because Taino is a very broad designation for a lot of different groups of people that the Europeans met when they arrived and kind of all lumped together, as the indigenous people of the area. Based on archaeology that has been done since then, we know that there are a lot of differences between groups on these different islands. So that's kind of what I'm looking at with my research, is starting to kind of identify, the specific group that was living in this area of Eastern Hispaniola, and try to identify kind of differences and commonalities and connections with other people in other islands, so that we can start to think about what kind of diversity is included in that Taino word. So I'm going to compare clay and ceramics from this part of the island to village sites and other types of sites in other areas, to try to basically see how much movement there are of these ceramics. So the reason that I'm targeting Padre first is because it is a submerged site, and I want to use other submerged sites in my research, and so I first have to make sure that that submersion, or basically being in solution for several hundred or thousands of years, would not necessarily impact the trace elements that are in the ceramics. So I'm hoping to begin with that and then expand the study to include more sites, so that I can compare and look at those connections across space. So we had a few meetings in Santo Domingo this round, and then I am coming back in July to really make some more connections and meet more community groups and all of that. As I said before, a lot of people kind of dismiss the Taino as being extinct, or as, kind of not existing anymore, which isn't true, and a lot of people now are beginning to reclaim some of that indigenous Caribbean identity. And so I'm hoping to work with, there's a ceramic workshop at Casa de Campo that they actually get, local clay, and then they do ceramics with it, so I want to work with them. On the more eastern side of the island, there's some archaeology groups that are doing some public archaeology, introduction to archaeology classes for the public. But just in general, I'm going to really make sure I share my research with the local people here, and I want to make sure that they have access, because so much of this knowledge has been lost, and it's really a disservice to a lot of those people that have that indigenous identity.
Just remember the tree roots full of trash.
One of the most important sites we went to based on those early discussions here with the government was the Aleta. The Aleta stands for the fin. It was named because of the former structures that were there. But the Aleta is a sinkhole. It's about the size of a ship's hatch cover, as described, we feel, by Las Casas.
Las Casas, Ramon Panay actually did take the time to try to learn about the indigenous culture here, and they recorded some things like religious beliefs, folklore, things like that the other Europeans weren't really paying attention to. They recorded a lot about this kind of axis mundi, or this connection between planes, I guess I would say, and the three planes that they identified that were really important to the Taino were the kind of heavens, or the stars, and then the material or earthly plane that we live on, and then this watery underworld underneath. So La Aleta is a little bit different than the other underwater sites because it is a sinkhole rather than kind of a cavern, so you can't really walk in. It's a hole in the ground in the middle of the forest in the East National Park here. And then once you get there, the sinkhole is quite a long way, I think about 200 feet before you hit the surface of the water, and then it's also very deep before you begin seeing any of the artifact deposits. But because the artifact deposit at the bottom is made up largely of intact things, so vessels, gourds, other kind of very important objects to the Taino, there's a canoe paddle, things like that. We think it's a ceremonial site because it seems to be that things were being deposited into this hole. And it's also unique because it has a sulfur chemocline kind of in between these two layers of water, which both protects them. So the water below the chemocline has very little oxygen, very little light, which allows a big preservation of organic artifacts, which is very, very rare. In archaeology, to have as big of a collection of organic artifacts as is at that site, as well as it creates this kind of milky division in the water that you would see if you dropped something in. And so you can imagine that if you believed in a watery underworld, if you put something in this hole, you would see it go down through this really clear water and then kind of disappear into this cloudy, milky sulfur layer, which is why we think it was kind of a very important site for a larger group of people.
But I think also this site relates to Puerto Rico. Las Casas said there were boats coming, canoes, daily from Puerto Rico. I don't think it was daily, but certainly on a regular basis, canoes crossed the Mona Passage. Where would they land? Right here in the southeast of Dominican Republic. Where would they go? I think they went to the Aleta. I think that was the Vatican of its time. And all the other Taino village sites we find around here, they still revered the water. It was important, these crystal clear pools of water that we find here in the southeast, this large karst topography that is really susceptible for percolation of water to make sinkholes. That crystal clear aquifer water had to be something that the Taino revered, but they still went into a place like the Aleta. And to try and do the studies locally, everywhere from up here in Cap Cana up around to the National Park, Côte de Bamena, to the Bayahiba area, this whole region was considered an agricultural center by the Taino, and certainly we think a religious center too. And it's important to us today to do the archaeology of these sites, to try and do the study, to tie this together to 21st century archaeology and methodology of scientific investigation, and I think that's what we're on. It's exciting, it's important, and it can rewrite the history of the Taino.